Reality of the unseen. Were one asked to characterize the life of religion in the broadest and most general terms possible, one might say that it consists of the belief that there is an unseen order, and that our supreme good lies in harmoniously adjusting ourselves thereto. This belief and this adjustment are the religious attitude of the soul. I wish during this hour to call your attention to some of the psychological peculiarities of such an attitude as this, of belief in an object which we cannot see. All our attitudes, moral, practical, or emotional, as well as religious, are due to the objects of our consciousness, the things which we believe to exist, whether really or ideally, along with ourselves. Such objects may be present to our senses, or they may be present only to our thought. In either case, they elicit from us a reaction, and the reaction due to things of thought is notoriously, in many cases, as strong as that due to sensible presences. It may even be stronger. The memory of an insult may make us angry than the insult did when we received it. We are frequently more ashamed of our blunders afterwards than when we were at the moment of making them. And in general, our whole higher prudential and moral life is based on the fact that material sensations actually present may have a weaker influence on our actions than ideas of remoter facts. The more concrete objects of most men's religion, the deities whom they worship, are known to them only in idea. It has been vouchsafed, for example, to very few Christian believers to have had a sensible vision of their Savior, though enough appearances of this sort are on record, by way of miraculous exception, to merit our attention later. The whole force of the Christian religion, therefore, so far as belief in the divine personages determines the prevalent attitude of the believer, is in general exerted by the instrumentality of pure ideas, of which nothing in the individual's past experience directly serves as a model. But in addition to these ideas of the more concrete religious objects, religion is full of abstract objects, which prove to have an equal power. God's attributes, as such, His holiness, His justice, His mercy, His absoluteness, His infinity, His omniscience, His triunity, the various mysteries of the redemptive process, the operation of the sacraments, etc., have proved fertile wells of inspiring meditation for Christian believers. Footnote, example, quote, I have had much comfort lately in meditating on the passages which show the personality of the Holy Ghost, and His distinctness from the Father and the Son. It is a subject that requires searching into to find out, but, when realized, gives one so much more true and lively a sense of the fullness of the Godhead and its work in us and to us, than when only thinking of the Spirit and its effect on us. Close quote. End footnote. We shall see later that the absence of definite sensible images is positively insisted on by the mystical authorities in all religions as the sine qua non of the successful orison, or contemplation of the higher divine truths. Such contemplations are expected, and abundantly verify the expectation, as we shall also see, to influence the believer's subsequent attitude very powerfully for good. Immanuel Kant held a curious doctrine about such objects of belief as God, the design of creation, the soul, its freedom, and the life hereafter. These things, he said, are properly not objects of knowledge at all. Our conceptions always require a sense content to work with, and as the words soul, God, immortality cover no distinctive sense content whatever, it follows that, theoretically speaking, they are words devoid of any significance. Yet, strangely enough, they have a definite meaning for our practice. We can act as if there were a God, feel as if we were free, consider nature as if she were full of special designs, lay plans as if we were to be immortal, and we find then that these words do make a genuine difference in our moral life. Our faith that these unintelligible objects actually exist proves thus to be a full equivalent in object of practice, as Kant calls it, or from the point of view of our action, for a knowledge of what they might be, in case we were permitted positively to conceive them. So we have the strange phenomenon, as Kant assures us, of a mind believing with all its strength in the real presence of a set of things of no one of which it can form any notion whatsoever. My object, thus recalling Kant's doctrine to your mind, is not to express any opinion as to the accuracy of this particularly uncouth part of his philosophy, but only to illustrate the characteristic of human nature which we are considering by an example so classical in its exaggeration. The sentiment of reality can indeed attach itself so strongly to our object of belief that our whole life is polarized through and through, so to speak, by its sense of the existence of the thing believed. And yet that thing, for purpose of definite description, can hardly be said to be present to our mind at all. It is as if a bar of iron, without touch or sight, with no representative faculty whatever, might nevertheless be strongly endowed with an inner capacity for magnetic feeling, as if through the various arousals of its magnetism by magnets coming and going in its neighborhood, it might be consciously determined to different attitudes and tendencies. Such a bar of iron could never give you an outward description of the agencies that had the power of stirring it so strongly, yet of their presence and of their significance for its life, it would be intensely aware from every fiber of its being. It is not only the ideas of pure reason, as Kant styled them, that have this power of making us vitally feel presences that we are impotent articulately to describe. All sorts of higher abstractions bring with them the same kind of impalpable appeal. Remember those passages from Emerson which I read in the last lecture. The whole universe of concrete objects, as we know them, swims, not only for such a transcendentalist writer, but for all of us, in a wider and higher universe of abstract ideas that lend it its significance. As time, space, and the aether soak through all things, so feel, do abstract and essential goodness, beauty, strength, significance, justice soak through all things good, strong, significant, and just. Such ideas, others equally abstract, form the background for all our facts, the fountainhead of all the possibilities we conceive of. They give its nature, as we call it, to every special thing. Everything we know is what it is by sharing in the nature of one of these abstractions. We can never look directly at them, for they are bodiless and featureless and footless, but we grasp all other things by their means, and in handling the real world, we should be stricken with helplessness in just so far forth as we might lose these mental objects, these adjectives and adverbs and predicates and heads of classification and conception. This absolute determinability of our mind by abstractions is one of the cardinal facts in our human constitution, polarizing and magnetizing us as they do. We turn towards them, and from them we seek them, hold them, hate them, bless them, just as if they were so many concrete beings. And beings they are, beings as real in the realm which they inhabit as the changing things of sense are in the realm of space. Plato gave so brilliant and impressive a defense of this common human feeling that the doctrine of the reality of abstract objects has been known as the Platonic theory of ideas ever since. Abstract beauty, for example, is for Plato a perfectly definite individual being, of which the intellect is aware as of something additional to all the Persian beauties of the earth. The true order of going, he says in the often quoted passage of his banquet, quote, is to use the beauties of earth as steps along which one mounts upwards for the sake of that other beauty, going from one to two, and from two to all fair forms, and from fair forms to fair actions, and from fair actions to fair notions, until from fair notions he arrives at the notion of absolute beauty, and at last knows what the essence of beauty is. Close quote. In our last lecture, we had a glimpse of the way in which a Platonizing writer like Emerson may treat the abstract divineness of things, the moral structure of the universe, as a fact worthy of worship. In those various churches without a God, which today are spreading through the world under the name of ethical societies, we have a similar worship of the abstract divine, the moral law believed in as an ultimate object. Science, in many minds, is genuinely taking the place of a religion. Where this is so, the scientist treats the laws of nature as objective facts to be revered. A brilliant school of interpretation of Greek mythology would have it that in their origin, the Greek gods were only half-metaphoric personifications of those great spheres of abstract law and order into which the natural world falls apart: the sky sphere, the ocean sphere, the earth sphere, and the like, just as even now we may speak of the smile of the morning, the kiss of the breeze, or the bite of the cold, without really that these phenomena of nature actually wear a human face. Footnote. Example, quote, nature is always so interesting, under whatever aspect she shows herself, that when it rains, I seem to see a beautiful woman weeping. She appears the more beautiful, the more afflicted she is. B. de Saint-Pierre. End footnote. As regards the origin of the Greek gods, we need not at present seek an opinion, but the whole array of our instances leads to a conclusion something like this. It is as if there were in the human consciousness a sense of reality, a feeling of objective presence, a perception of what we may call something there, more deep and more general than any of the special and particular senses by which the current psychology supposes existent realities to be originally revealed. If this were so, we might suppose the senses to waken our attitudes and conduct as they so habitually do, by first exciting this sense of reality. But anything else, any idea, for example, might similarly excite it, would have that same prerogative of appearing real, which objects of sense normally possess. So far as religious conceptions were able to touch this reality feeling, they would be believed in spite of criticism, even though they might be so vague and remote as to be almost unimaginable, even though they might be such non-entities in point of whatness, as Kant makes the objects of his moral theology to be. The most curious proofs of the existence of such an undifferentiated sense of reality as this are found in experiences of hallucination. It often happens that an hallucination is imperfectly developed. The person affected will feel a presence in the room, definitely localized, facing in one particular way, real in the most emphatic sense of the word, often coming suddenly, and as suddenly gone, and yet neither seen, heard, touched, nor cognized in any of the usual sensible ways. Let me give you an example of this before I pass to the objects with whose presence religion is more peculiarly concerned. An intimate friend of mine, one of the keenest intellects I know, has had several experiences of this sort. He writes as follows in response to my inquiries. Quote, I have several times within the past few years felt the so-called consciousness of a presence. The experiences which I have in mind are clearly distinguishable from another kind of experience, which I have had very frequently, and which I fancy many persons would also call the consciousness of a presence. But the difference for me between the two sets of experience is as great as the difference between feeling a slight warmth originating I know not where, and standing in the midst of a conflagration with all the ordinary senses alert. It was about September 1884 when I had the first experience. On the previous night, I had had, after getting into bed at my rooms in college, a vivid tactile hallucination of being grasped by the arm, which made me get up and search the room for an intruder. But the sense of presence, properly so called, came on the next night. After I had got into bed and blown out the candle, I lay awake a while thinking on the previous night's experience, when suddenly I felt something come into the room and stay close to my bed. It remained only a minute or two. I did not recognize it by any ordinary sense, and yet there was a horribly unpleasant sensation connected with it. It stirred something more at the roots of my being than any ordinary perception. The feeling had something of the quality of a very large, tearing, vital pain spreading chiefly over the chest, but within the organism. And yet the feeling was not a pain so much as abhorrence. At all events, something was present with me, and I knew its presence far more surely than I have ever known the presence of any fleshly living creature. I was conscious of its departure as of its coming, and almost instantaneously swift going through the door, and the horrible sensation disappeared. On the third night, when I retired, my mind was absorbed in some lectures which I was preparing, and I was still absorbed in these when I became aware of the actual presence, though not of the coming of the thing that was there the night before, and of the horrible sensation. I then mentally concentrated all my effort to charge this thing, if it was evil, to depart. If it was not evil, to tell me who or what it was, and if it could not explain itself, to go, and that I would compel it to go. It went as on the previous night, and my body quickly recovered its normal state. On 2 other occasions in my life, I have had precisely the same horrible sensation. Once, it lasted a full quarter of an hour. In all 3 instances, the certainty that there in outward space there stood something was indescribably stronger than the ordinary certainty of companionship when we are in the close presence of ordinary living people. The something seemed close to me, and intensely more real than any ordinary perception. Although I felt it to be like unto myself, so to speak, or finite, small, and distressful, as it were, I didn't recognize it as any individual being or person. Close quote. Of course, such an experience as this does not connect itself with the religious sphere. Yet, it may upon occasion do so, and the same correspondent informs me that at more than one other conjuncture he had the sense of presence developed with equal intensity and abruptness. Only then it was filled with a quality of joy. Quote, "There was not a mere consciousness of something there, but fused in the central happiness of it a startling awareness of some ineffable good. Not vague either, not like the emotional effect of some poem or scene or blossom of music, but the sure knowledge of the close presence of a sort of mighty person. And after it went, the memory persisted as the one perception of reality. Everything else might be a dream, but not that." Close quote. My friend, as it oddly happens, does not interpret these latter experiences theistically, as signifying the presence of God, but it would clearly not have been unnatural to interpret them as a revelation of a deity's existence. When we reach the subject of mysticism, we shall have much more to say upon this head. Lest the oddity of these phenomena should disconcert you, I will venture to read you a couple of similar narratives, much shorter, merely to show that we are dealing with a well-marked natural kind of fact. In the first case, which I take from the Journal of the Society for Physical Research, the sense of presence developed in a few moments into a distinctly visualized hallucination. But I will leave that part of the story out. Quote, "I had read," the narrator says, "some 20 minutes or so, was thoroughly absorbed in the book. My mind was perfectly quiet, and for the time being, my friends were quite forgotten. When suddenly, without a moment's warning, my whole being seemed roused to the highest state of tension or aliveness, as it were, with an intenseness not easily imagined by those who had never experienced it, that another being or presence was not only in the room, but quite close to me. I put my book down, and although my excitement was great, I felt quite collected, and not conscious of any sense of fear. Without changing my position, I looked straight at the fire. I knew somehow that my friend, A.H., was standing at my left elbow, but so far behind me as to be hidden by the armchair in which I was leaning back. Moving my eyes round slightly without otherwise changing my position, the lower portion of one leg became visible, and I instantly recognized the gray-blue material of trousers he often wore. But the stuff appeared semi-transparent, reminding me of tobacco smoke in consistency. And thereupon, the visual hallucination came. Close quote. Another informant writes, quote, "Quite early in the night, I was awakened. I felt as if I had been aroused intentionally, and at first thought someone was breaking into the house. I then turned on my side to go to sleep again, and immediately felt a consciousness of a presence in the room. And singular to state, it was not the consciousness of a live person, but of a spiritual presence. This may provoke a smile, but I can only tell you the facts as they occurred to me. I do not know how to better describe my sensations than by simply stating that I felt a consciousness of a spiritual presence. I felt also, at the same time, a strong feeling of superstitious dread, as if something strange and fearful were about to happen." Close quote. Professor Flournoy of Geneva gives me the following testimony of a friend of his, a lady who has the gift of automatic or involuntary writing. Quote, "Whenever I practice automatic writing, what makes me feel that it is not due to a subconscious self is the feeling I always have of a foreign presence external to my body. It is sometimes so definitely characterized that I could point to its exact position. This impression of presence is impossible to describe. It varies in intensity and clearness according to the personality from whom the writing professes to come. If it is someone whom I love, I feel it immediately, before any writing has come. My heart seems to recognize it." Close quote. In an earlier book of mine, I have cited at full length a curious case of presence felt by a blind man. The presence was that of a figure of a gray-bearded man dressed in a pepper and salt suit, squeezing himself under the crack of the door and moving across the floor of the room towards the sofa. The blind subject of this quasi-hallucination is an exceptionally intelligent reporter. He is entirely without internal visual imagery and cannot represent light or colors to himself, but is positive that his other senses, hearing, etc., were not involved in this false perception. It seems to have been an abstract conception, rather, with the feelings of reality and spatial outwardness directly attached to it. In other words, a fully objectified and exteriorized idea. Such cases, taken along with others which would be too tedious for quotation, seem sufficiently to prove the existence in our mental machinery of a sense of present reality more diffused and general than that which our special senses yield. For the psychologists, the tracing of the organic seat of such a feeling would form a pretty problem. Nothing could be more natural than to connect it with the muscular sense, with the feeling that our muscles were innervating themselves for action. Whatsoever thus innervated our activity, or made our flesh creep, our senses are what do so oftenest, might then appear real and present, even though it were but an abstract idea. But with such vague conjectures, we have no concern at present, for our interest lies with the faculty rather than with its organic seat. Like all positive affections of consciousness, the sense of reality has its negative counterpart in the shape of a feeling of unreality by which persons may be haunted, and of which one sometimes hears complaint. Quote, "When I reflect on the fact that I have made my appearance by accident upon a globe its self-world through space as the sport of the catastrophes of the heavens, says Madame Ackerman. When I see myself surrounded by beings as ephemeral and incomprehensible as I am myself, and all excitedly pursuing pure chimeras, I experience a strange feeling of being in a dream. It seems to me as if I have loved and suffered, and that ere long I shall die in a dream. My last word will be, I have been dreaming. Close quote. In another lecture, we shall see how, in morbid melancholy, this sense of the unreality of things may become a carking pain, and even lead to suicide. We may now lay it down as certain that in the distinctively religious sphere of experience, many persons, how many we cannot tell, possess the objects of their belief, not in the form of mere conceptions which their intellect accepts as true, but rather in the form of quasi-sensible realities, directly apprehended. As this sense of the real presence of these objects fluctuates, so the believer alternates between warmth and coldness in his faith. Other examples will bring this home to one better than abstract description, so I proceed immediately to cite some. The first example is a negative one, deploring the loss of the sense in question. I have extracted it from an account given me by a scientific man of my acquaintance, of his religious life. It seems to me to show clearly that the feeling of reality may be something more like a sensation than an intellectual operation, properly so called. Quote, between 20 and 30, I gradually became more and more agnostic and irreligious. Yet I cannot say that I ever lost that indefinite consciousness which Herbert Spencer describes so well, of an absolute reality behind phenomena. For me, this reality was not the pure unknowable of Spencer's philosophy, for although I had ceased my childish prayers to God and never prayed to it in a formal manner, yet my more recent experience shows me to have been in a relation to it, which practically was the same thing as prayer. Whenever I had any trouble, especially when I had conflict with other people, either domestically or in the way of business, or when I was depressed in spirits or anxious about affairs, I now recognize that I used to fall back for support upon this curious relation I felt myself to be in this fundamental cosmical it. It was on my side, or I was on its side, however you please to term it, in a particular trouble, and it always strengthened me and seemed to give me endless vitality to feel its underlying and supporting presence. In fact, it was an unfailing fountain of living justice, truth, and strength, to which I instinctively turned at times of weakness, and it always brought me out. I know now that it was a personal relation I was in to it. Because of late years, the power of communicating with it has left me, and I am conscious of a perfectly definite loss. I used never to fail to find it when I turned to it. Then came a set of years when sometimes I found it, and then again I would be wholly unable to make a connection with it. I remember many occasions on which, at night in bed, I would be unable to get to sleep on account of worry. I turned this way and that in the darkness, and groped mentally for the familiar sense of that higher mind of my mind, which had always seemed to be close at hand, as it were, closing the passage and yielding support. But there was no electric current. A blank was there instead of it. I couldn't find anything. Now, at the age of nearly 50, my power of getting into connection with it has entirely left me, and I have to confess that a great help has gone out of my life. Life has become curiously dead and indifferent, and I can now see that my old experience was probably exactly the same thing as the prayers of the Orthodox, only I did not call them by that name. What I have spoken of as it was practically not Spencer's unknowable, but just my own instinctive and individual God, whom I relied upon for higher sympathy, but whom somehow I have lost. Close quote. Nothing is more common in the pages of religious biography than the way in which seasons of lively and of difficult faith are described as alternating. Probably every religious person has the recollection of particular crises in which a directer vision of the truth, a direct perception, perhaps, of a living God's existence, swept in and overwhelmed the languor of the more ordinary belief. In James Russell Lowell's correspondence, there is a brief memorandum of an experience of this kind. Quote, I had a revelation last Friday evening. I was at Mary's, and happening to say something of the presence of spirits, of whom, I said, I was often dimly aware. Mr. Putnam entered into an argument with me on spiritual matters. As I was speaking, the whole system rose before me like a vague destiny looming from the abyss. I never before so clearly felt the Spirit of God in me and around me. The whole room seemed to me full of God. The air seemed to waver to and fro with the presence of something, I knew not what. I spoke with the calmness and clearness of a prophet. I cannot tell you what this revelation was. I have not yet studied it through, but I shall perfect it one day, and then you shall hear it and acknowledge its grandeur. Close quote. Here is a longer and more developed experience from a manuscript communication by a clergyman. I take it from Starbuck's manuscript collection. Quote, I remember the night, and almost the very spot on the hilltop where my soul opened up, as it were, into the infinite, and there was a rushing together of the two worlds, the inner and the outer. It was deep calling unto deep, the deep that my own struggle had opened up within, being answered by the unfathomable deep without, reaching beyond the stars. I stood alone with him who had made me, and all the beauty of the world, and love, and sorrow, and even temptation. I did not seek him, but felt the perfect unison of my spirit with his. The ordinary sense of things around me faded. For the moment, nothing but an ineffable joy and exaltation remained. It is impossible fully to describe the experience. It was like the effect of some great orchestra when all the separate notes have melted into one swelling harmony that leaves the listener conscious of nothing save that his soul is being wafted upwards and almost bursting with its own emotion. The perfect stillness of the night was thrilled by a more solemn silence. The darkness held a presence that was all the more felt because it was not seen. I could not any more have doubted that he was there than that I was. Indeed, I felt myself to be, if possible, the less real of the two. My highest faith in God and truest idea of him were then born in me. I have stood upon the mount of vision since, and felt the eternal round about me. but never since has there come quite the same stirring of the heart. Then, if ever, I believe, I stood face to face with God and was born anew of his Spirit. There was, as I recall it, no sudden change of thought or of belief, except that my early crude conception had, as it were, burst into flower. There was no destruction of the old, but a rapid, wonderful unfolding. Since that time, no discussion that I have heard of the proofs of God's existence have been able to shake my faith. Having once felt the presence of God's Spirit, I have never lost it again for long. My most assuring evidence of his existence is deeply rooted in that hour of vision, in the memory of that supreme experience, and in that conviction gained from reading and reflection that something the same has come to all who have found God. I am aware that it may justly be called mystical. I am not enough acquainted with philosophy to defend it from that or any other charge. I feel that in writing of it, I have overlaid it with words rather than put it clearly to your thought. But, such as it is, I have described it as carefully as I now am able to do. Close quote. Here is another document, even more definite in character, which the writer, being a Swiss, I translate from the French original. Quote, I was in perfect health. We were on our 6th day of tramping and in good training. We had come to the day before from Sixt to Trient by Biret. I felt neither fatigue, hunger, nor thirst, and my state of mind was equally healthy. I had had a foreless good news from home. I was subject to no anxiety, neither near or remote, for we had a good guide, and there was not a shadow of uncertainty about the road we should follow. I can best describe the condition in which I was by calling it a state of equilibrium, when all at once I experienced a feeling of being raised above myself. I felt the presence of God. I tell of the thing just as I was conscious of it, as if this goodness and his power were penetrating me altogether. The throb of emotion was so violent that I could barely tell the boys to pass on and not wait for me. I then sat down on a stone, unable to stand any longer, and my eyes overflowed with tears. I thanked God that in the course of my life he had taught me to know him, that he sustained my life and took pity both on the insignificant creature and on the sinner that I was. I begged him ardently that my life might be consecrated to the doing of his will. I felt his reply, which was that I should do his will from day to day in humility and poverty, leaving him, the Almighty God, to be judge of whether I should sometime be called to bear witness more conspicuously. Then, slowly, the ecstasy left my heart. That is, I felt that God had withdrawn the communion which he had granted, and I was able to walk on, but very slowly. So strongly was I still possessed by the interior emotion. Besides, I had wept uninterruptedly for several minutes. My eyes were swollen, and I did not wish my companions to see me. The state of ecstasy may have lasted 4 or 5 minutes, although it seemed at the time to last much longer. My comrades waited for me 10 minutes at the cross of Berine, but I took about 25 or 30 minutes to join them, for as well as I can remember, they said that I had kept them back for about half an hour. The impression had been so profound that in climbing slowly the slope, I asked myself if it were possible that Moses on Sinai could have had a more intimate communication with God. I think it well to add that in this ecstasy of mine, God had neither form, color, odor, nor taste. Moreover, that the feeling of his presence was accompanied with no determinate localization. It was rather as if my personality had been transformed by the presence of a spiritual spirit. But the more I seek words to express this intimate intercourse, the more I feel the impossibility of describing the thing by any of our usual images. At bottom, the expression most apt to render what I felt is this: God was present, though invisible. He fell under no one of my senses, yet my consciousness perceived him. Close quote. The adjective mystical is technically applied, most often, to states that are of brief duration. Of course, such hours of rapture as the last two persons describe are mystical experiences, of which in a later lecture I shall have much to say. Meanwhile, here is the abridged record of another mystical or semi-mystical experience, in a mind evidently framed by nature for ardent piety. I owe it to Starbuck's collection. The lady who gives the account is the daughter of a man well known in his time as a writer against Christianity. The suddenness of her conversion shows well how native the sense of God's presence must be to certain minds. She relates that she was brought up in entire ignorance of Christian doctrine, but when in Germany, after being talked to by Christian friends, she read the Bible and prayed, and finally the plan of salvation flashed upon her like a stream of light. Quote, "To this day," she writes, "I cannot understand dallying with religion and the commands of God. The very instant I heard my Father's cry calling unto me, my heart bounded in recognition. I ran, I stretched forth my arms, I cried aloud, 'Here, here I am, my Father! O happy child, what should I do?' 'Love me,' answered my God. 'I do, I do,' I cried passionately. 'Come unto me,' called my Father. 'I will,' my heart panted. Did I stop to ask a single question? Not one. It never occurred to me to ask whether I was good enough, or to hesitate over my unfitness, or to find out what I thought of his church, or to wait until I should be satisfied. Satisfied? I was satisfied. Had I not found my God and my Father? Did he not love me? Had he not called me? Was there not a church into which I might enter? Since then, I have had direct answers to prayer, so significant as to be almost like talking with God and hearing his answer. The idea of God's reality has never left me for a moment." Close quote. Here is still another case, the writer being a man aged 27, in which the experience, probably almost as characteristic, is less vividly described. Quote, "I have on a number of occasions felt that I had enjoyed a period of intimate communion with the divine. These meetings came unasked and unexpected, and seemed to consist merely in the temporary obliteration of the conventionalities which usually surround and cover my life. Once it was when from the summit of a high mountain I looked over a gashed and corrugated landscape extending to a long convex of ocean that ascended to the horizon, and again from the same point when I could see nothing beneath me but a boundless expanse of white cloud, on the brown surface of which a few high peaks, including the one I was on, seemed plunging about as if they were dragging their anchors. What I felt on these occasions was a temporary loss of my own identity, accompanied by an illumination which revealed to me a deeper significance than I had been wont to attach to life. It is in this that I find my justification for saying that I have enjoyed communication with God. Of course, the absence of such a being as this would be chaos. I cannot conceive of life without its presence. Close quote. Of the more habitual, and so to speak, chronic sense of God's presence, the following sample from Professor Starbuck's manuscript collection may serve to give an idea. It is from a man aged 49. Probably thousands of unpretending Christians would write an almost identical account. Quote, God is more real to me than any thought or thing or person. I feel his presence positively, and the more as I live in closer harmony with his laws as written in my body and mind. I feel him in the sunshine or rain, and awe mingled with a delicious restfulness most nearly describes my feelings. I talk to him as to a companion in prayer and praise, and our communion is delightful. He answers me again and again, often in words so clearly spoken that it seems my outer ear must have carried the tone, but generally in strong mental impressions. Usually a text of Scripture, unfolding some new view of him and his love for me and care for my safety. I could give hundreds of instances in school matters, social problems, financial difficulties, etc. That he is mine and I am his never leaves me. It is an abiding joy. Without it, life would be a blank, a desert, a shoreless, tractless waste. Close quote. I subjoined some more examples from writers of different ages and sexes. They are also from Professor Starbuck's collection, and their number might be greatly multiplied. The first is from a man 27 years old. Quote, God is quite real to me. I talk to him and often get answers. Thoughts sudden and distinct from any I have been entertaining come to my mind after asking God for his direction. Something over a year ago, I was for some weeks in the direst perplexity. When the trouble first appeared before me, I was dazed, but before long, 2 or 3 hours, I could hear distinctly a passage of Scripture, "My grace is sufficient for thee." Every time my thoughts turned to the trouble, I could hear this quotation. I don't think I ever doubted the existence of God or had him drop out of my consciousness. God has frequently stepped into my affairs very perceptibly, and I feel that he directs many little details all the time. But on 2 or 3 occasions, he has ordered ways for me very contrary to my ambitions and plans. Close quote. Another statement, none the less valuable psychologically for being so decidedly childish, is that of a boy of 17. Quote, sometimes as I go to church, I sit down, join in the service, and before I go out, I feel as if God was with me, right side of me, singing and reading the Psalms with me. And then again, I feel as if I could sit beside him and put my arms around him, kiss him, etc. When I am taking Holy Communion at the altar, I try to get with him and generally feel his presence. Close quote. I let a few other cases follow at random. Quote, God surrounds me like the physical atmosphere. He is closer to me than my own breath. In him literally I live and move and have my being. Quote, there are times when I seem to stand in his very presence, to talk with him. Answers to prayer have come, sometimes direct and overwhelming in their revelation of his presence and powers. There are times when God seems far off, but this is always my own fault. Quote, I have the sense of a presence, strong and at the same time soothing, which hovers over me. Sometimes it seems to enwrap me with sustaining arms. Close quote. Such is the human ontological imagination, and such is the convincingness of what it brings to birth. Unpicturable beings are realized, and realized with an intensity almost like that of an hallucination. They determine our vital attitude as decisively as the vital attitude of lovers is determined by the habitual sense by which each is haunted of the other being in the world. A lover has notoriously this sense of the continuous being of his idol, even when his attention is addressed to other matters and he no longer represents her features. He cannot forget her. She uninterruptedly affects him through and through. I spoke of the convincingness of these feelings of reality, and I must dwell a moment longer on that point. They are as convincing to those who have them as any direct sensible experiences can be, and they are, as a rule, much more convincing than results established by mere logic ever are. One may indeed be entirely without them, probably more than one of you here present is without them in any marked degree. But if you do have them, and have them at all strongly, the probability is that you cannot help regarding them as genuine perceptions of truth, as revelations of a kind of reality which no adverse argument, however unanswerable by you in words, can expel from your belief. The opinion opposed to mysticism in philosophy is sometimes spoken of as rationalism. Rationalism insists that all our beliefs ought ultimately to find for themselves articulate grounds. Such grounds for rationalism must consist of four things. 1. Definitely statable abstract principles. 2. Definite facts of sensation. 3. Definite hypotheses based on such facts. And 4. Definite inferences logically drawn. Vague impressions of something indefinable have no place in the rationalistic system, which, on its positive side, is surely a splendid intellectual tendency. For not only are all our philosophies fruits of it, but physical science, amongst other good things, is its result. Nevertheless, if we look on man's whole mental life as it exists, on the life of men that lies in them apart from their learning and science, and that they inwardly and privately follow, we have to confess that the part of it of which rationalism can give an account is relatively superficial. It is the part that has the prestige, undoubtedly, for it has the loquacity. It can challenge you for proofs, and chop logic, and put you down with words. But it will fail to convince or convert you all the same if your dumb intuitions are opposed to its conclusions. If you have intuitions at all, they come from a deeper level of your nature than the loquacious level which rationalism inhabits. Your whole subconscious life, your impulses, your faiths, Your needs, your divinations, have prepared the premises of which your consciousness now feels the weight of the result, and something in you absolutely knows that that result must be truer than any logic-chopping rationalistic talk, however clever, that may contradict it. This inferiority of the rationalistic level in founding belief is just as manifest when rationalism argues for religion as when it argues against it. That vast literature of proofs of God's existence drawn from the order of nature, which a century ago seemed so overwhelmingly convincing, today does little more than gather dust in libraries, for the simple reason that our generation has ceased to believe in the kind of God it argued for. Whatever sort of a being God may be, we know today that he is never more that mere external inventor of contrivances intended to make manifest his glory, in which our great-grandfathers took such satisfaction. Though just how we know this we cannot possibly make clear by words, either to ourselves or to others. I defy any of you here fully to account for your persuasion that if a God exists, he must be a more cosmic and tragic personage than that being. The truth is that in the metaphysical and religious sphere, articulate reasons are cogent for us only when our inarticulate feelings of reality have already been impressed in favor of the same conclusion. Then, indeed, our intuitions and our reason work together, and great world-ruling systems, like that of the Buddhist or of the Catholic philosophy, may grow up. Our impulsive belief is here always what sets up the original body of truth, and our articulately verbalized philosophy is but its showy translation into formulas. The unreasoned and immediate assurance is the deep thing in us. The reasoned argument is but a surface exhibition. Instinct leads, intelligence does but follow. If a person feels the presence of a living God after the fashion shown by my quotations, your critical arguments, be they never so superior, will vainly set themselves to change his faith. Please observe, however, that I do not yet say that it is better that the subconscious and non-rational should thus hold primacy in the religious realm. I confine myself to simply pointing out that they do so hold it as a matter of fact. So much for our sense of the reality of the religious objects. Let me now say a brief word more about the attitudes they characteristically awaken. We have already agreed that they are solemn, and we have seen reason to think that the most distinctive of them is the sort of joy which may result in extreme cases from absolute self-surrender. The sense of the kind of object to which the surrender is made has much to do with determining the precise complexion of the joy, and the whole phenomenon is more complex than any simple formula allows. In the literature of the subject, sadness and gladness have each been emphasized in turn. The ancient saying that the first maker of the gods was fear receives voluminous corroboration from every age of religious history. But none the less does religious history show the part which joy has evermore tended to play. Sometimes the joy has been primary, sometimes secondary, being the gladness of deliverance from the fear. This latter state of things, being the more complex, is also the more complete. And as we proceed, I think we shall have abundant reason for refusing to leave out either the sadness or the gladness, if we look at religion with the breadth of view which it demands. Stated in the completest possible terms, a man's religion involves both moods of contraction and moods of expansion of his being. But the quantitative mixture and order of these moods varies so much from one age of the world, from one system of thought, and from one individual to another, that you may insist either on the dread and the submission, or on the peace and the freedom as the essence of the matter, and still remain materially within the limits of the truth. The constitutionally somber and the constitutionally sanguine onlooker are bound to emphasize opposite aspects of what lies before their eyes. The constitutionally somber religious person makes even of his religious peace a very sober thing. Danger still hovers in the air about it. Flexion and contraction are not wholly checked. It were sparrow-like and childish after our deliverance to explode into twittering laughter and caper-cutting, and utterly to forget the imminent hawk on the bough. Lie low, rather, lie low, for you are in the hands of a living God. In the book of Job, for example, the impotence of man and the omnipotence of God is the exclusive burden of its author's mind. Quote, "It is as high as heaven. What canst thou do? Deeper than hell. What canst thou know?" Close quote. There is an astringent relish about the truth of this conviction which some men can feel, and which for them is as near an approach as can be made to the feeling of religious joy. Quote, "In Job," says that coldly truthful writer, the author of Mark Rutherford, "God reminds us that man is not the measure of his creation. The world is immense, constructed on no plan or theory which the intellect of man can grasp. It is transcendent everywhere. This is the burden of every verse, and is the secret, if there be one, of the poem. Sufficient or insufficient, there is nothing more. God is great, we know not his ways. He takes from us all we have, but yet, if we possess our souls in patience, we may pass the valley of the shadow and come out in sunlight again. We may, or we may not. What more have we to say now than God said from the whirlwind over 2,500 years ago?" Close quote. If we turn to the sanguine onlooker, on the other hand, we find that deliverance is felt as incomplete unless the burden be altogether overcome and the danger forgotten. Such onlookers give us definitions that seem to the somber minds of whom we have just been speaking to leave out all the solemnity that makes religious peace so different from merely animal joys. In the opinion of some writers, an attitude might be called religious, though no touch were left in it of sacrifice or submission, no tendency to flexion, no bowing of the head. Any habitual and regulated admiration, says Professor J.R. Seeley, is worthy to be called a religion. And accordingly, he thinks that our music, our science, and our so-called civilization, as these things are now organized and admirably believed in, form the more genuine religions of our time. Certainly, the unhesitating and unreasoning way in which we feel that we must inflict our civilization upon lower races by means of Hotchkiss guns, etc., reminds one of nothing so much as of the early spirit of Islam spreading its religion by the sword. In my last lecture, I quoted to you the ultra-radical opinion of Mr. Havelock Ellis that laughter of any sort may be considered a religious exercise, for it bears witness to the soul's emancipation. I quoted this opinion in order to deny its adequacy. But we must now settle our scores more carefully with this whole optimistic way of thinking. It is far too complex to be decided offhand. I propose accordingly that we make this. If we were to ask the question, what is human life's chief concern? One of the answers we should receive would be, it is happiness. How to gain, how to keep, how to recover happiness is in fact for most men at all times the secret motive of all they do and of all they are willing to endure. The hedonistic school in ethics deduces the moral life wholly from the experiences of happiness and unhappiness, which different kinds of conduct bring. And even more in the religious life than in the moral life, happiness and unhappiness seem to be the poles around which the interest revolves. We need not go so far as to say, with the author whom I lately quoted, that any persistent enthusiasm is, as such, religion, nor need we call mere laughter a religious exercise. But we must admit that any persistent enjoyment may produce the sort of religion which consists in a grateful admiration of the gift of so happy an existence. And we must also acknowledge that the more complex ways of experiencing religion are new manners of producing happiness, wonderful inner paths to a supernatural kind of happiness when the first gift of natural existence is unhappy, as it so often proves itself to be. With such relations between religion and happiness, it is perhaps not surprising that men come to regard the happiness which a religious belief affords as a proof of its truth. If a creed makes a man feel happy, he almost inevitably adopts it. Such a belief ought to be true, therefore it is true. Such, rightly or wrongly, is one of the immediate inferences of the religious logic used by ordinary men. The near presence of God's Spirit, says a German writer, quote, may be experienced in its reality, indeed only experienced, and the mark by which the Spirit's existence and nearness are made irrefutably clear to those who have ever had the experience is the utterly incomparable feeling of happiness, which is connected with the nearness, and which is therefore not only a possible and altogether proper feeling for us to have here below, but is the best and most indispensable proof of God's reality. No other proof is equally convincing, and therefore happiness is the point from which every efficacious new theology should start. Close quote. In the hour immediately before us, I shall invite you to consider the simpler kinds of religious happiness, leaving the more complex sorts to be treated on a later day. In many persons, happiness is congenital and irreclaimable. Cosmic emotion inevitably takes in them the form of enthusiasm and freedom. I speak not only of those who are amiably happy, I mean those who, when unhappiness is offered or proposed to them, positively refuse to feel it, as if it were something mean and wrong. We find such persons in every age, passionately flinging themselves upon their sense of the goodness of life, in spite of the hardships of their own condition, and in spite of the sinister theologies into which they may be born. From the outset, their religion is one of union with the divine. The heretics who went before the Reformation are lavishly accused by the church writers of antinomian practices, just as the first Christians were accused of indulgence in orgies by the Romans. It is probable that there never has been a century in which the deliberate refusal to think ill of life has not been idealized by a sufficient number of persons to form sects, open or secret, who claimed all natural things to be permitted. St. Augustine's maxim, dilige et quod vis fac, if you love but God, you may do as you incline, is morally one of the profoundest of observations, yet it is pregnant for such persons with passports beyond the bounds of conventional morality. According to their characters, they have been refined or gross, but their belief has been at all times systematic enough to constitute a definite religious attitude. God was for them a giver of freedom, and the sting of evil was overcome. St. Francis and his immediate disciples were, on the whole, of this company of spirits, of which there are of course infinite varieties. Rousseau, in the earlier years of his writing, Diderot, Bede Saint-Pierre, and many of the leaders of the 18th century anti-Christian movement were of this optimistic type. They owed their influence to a certain authoritativeness in their feeling that nature, if you will only trust her sufficiently, is absolutely good. It is to be hoped that we all have some friend, perhaps more often feminine than masculine, and young than old, whose soul is of this sky blue tint, whose affinities are rather with flowers and birds, and all enchanting innocencies, than with dark human passions, who can think no ill of man or God, and in whom religious gladness, being in possession from the outset, needs no deliverance from any antecedent burden. God has two families of children on this earth, says Francis W. Newman, the once-born and the twice-born. And the once-born he describes as follows, quote, "They see God not as a strict judge, not as a glorious potentate, but as the animating spirit of a beautiful, harmonious world, beneficent and kind, merciful as well as pure. The same characters generally have no metaphysical tendencies. They do not look back into themselves. Hence, they are not distressed by their own imperfections. Yet it would be absurd to call them self-righteous, for they hardly think of themselves at all. This childlike quality of their nature makes the opening of religion very happy to them, for they no more shrink from God than a child from an emperor, before whom the parent trembles. In fact, they have no vivid conception of any of the qualities in which the severer majesty of God consists." Footnote: I once heard a lady describe the pleasure it gave her to think that she could always cuddle up to God. End footnote. He is to them the impersonation of kindness and beauty. They read his character not in the disordered world of man, but in romantic and harmonious nature. Of human sin they know perhaps little in their own hearts, and not very much in the world,
and human suffering does but melt them to tenderness. Thus, when they approach God, no inward disturbance ensues, and without being as yet spiritual, they have a certain complacency and perhaps romantic sense of excitement in their simple worship. Close quote. In the Romish Church, such characters find a more congenial soil to grow in than in Protestantism, whose fashions of feeling have been set by minds of a decidedly pessimistic order. But even in Protestantism, they have been abundant enough, and in its recent liberal developments of Unitarianism and Latitudinarianism, generally, minds of this order have played and still are playing leading and constructive parts. Emerson himself is an admirable example. Theodore Parker is another. Here are a couple of characteristic passages from Parker's correspondence. Quote, "Orthodox scholars say, in the heathen classics you find no consciousness of sin. It is very true, God be thanked for it. They were conscious of wrath, of cruelty, avarice, drunkenness, lust, sloth, cowardice, and other actual vices, and struggled and got rid of the deformities. But they were not conscious of enmity against God, and didn't sit down and whine and groan against non-existent evil. I have done wrong things enough in my life, and do them now. I miss the mark, draw a bow, and try again. But I am not conscious of hating God or man, or right or love, and I know there is much health in me, and in any body, even now, there dwelleth many a good thing, spite of consumption, St. Paul." Close quote. In another letter, Parker writes, quote, "I have swum in clear sweet waters all my days, and if sometimes they were a little cold, and the stream ran adverse and something rough, it was never too strong to be breasted and swum through. From the days of earliest boyhood, when I went stumbling through the grass, up to the gray-bearded manhood of this time, there is none but has left me honey in the hive of memory that I now feed on for present delight. When I recall the years, I am filled with a sense of sweetness and wonder that such little things can make a mortal so exceedingly rich. But I must confess that the chiefest of all my delights is still the religious." Close quote. Another good expression of the once-born type of consciousness, developing straight and natural with no element of morbid compunction or crisis, is contained in the answer of Dr. Edward Everett Hale, the eminent Unitarian preacher and writer, to one of Dr. Starbuck's circulars. I quote a part of it. Quote, "I observe with profound regret the religious struggles which come into many biographies, as if almost essential to the formation of the hero. I ought to speak of these, to say that any man has an advantage not to be estimated, who is born, as I was, into a family where the religion is simple and rational, who is trained in the theory of such a religion, so that he never knows, for an hour, what these religious or irreligious struggles are. I always knew God loved me, and I was always grateful to him for the world he placed me in. I always liked to tell him so, and was always glad to receive his suggestions to me. I can remember perfectly that when I was coming to manhood, the half-philosophical novels of the time had a deal to say about the young men and maidens who were facing the problems of life. I had no idea whatever what the problem of life was. To live with all my might seemed to me easy. To learn where there was so much to learn seemed pleasant and almost of course. To lend a hand, if one had a chance, natural. And if one did this, why, he enjoyed life, because he could not help it, and without proving to himself that he ought to enjoy it. A child who is early taught that he is God's child, that he may live and move and have his being in God, and that he has, therefore, infinite strength at hand for the conquering of any difficulty, will take life more easily, and probably will make more of it than one who is told that he is born the child of wrath and wholly incapable of good. Close quote. One can but recognize in such writers as these the presence of a temperament organically weighted on the side of cheer, and fatally forbidden to linger, as those of opposite temperament linger, over the darker aspects of the universe. In some individuals, optimism may become quasi-pathological. The capacity for even a transient sadness or a momentary humility seems cut off from them as by a kind of congenital anesthesia. Footnote: I know not to what physical laws philosophers will someday refer the feelings of melancholy. For myself, I find that they are the most voluptuous of all sensations, writes Saint Pierre, and accordingly he devotes a series of sections of his work on nature to the plaisir de la brune, plaisir des tombeaux, ruine de la nature, plaisir de la solitude, each of them more optimistic than the last. End footnote. This finding of luxury in woe is very common during adolescence. The truth-telling Marie Bashkirtseff expresses it well. Quote, in this depression and dreadful uninterrupted suffering, I don't condemn life. On the contrary, I like it and find it good. Can you believe it? I find everything good and pleasant, even my tears, my grief. I enjoy weeping. I enjoy my despair. I enjoy being exasperated and sad. I feel as if these were so many diversions, and I love life in spite of them all. I want to live on. It would be cruel to have me die when I am so accommodating. I cry, I grieve, and at the same time I am pleased. No, not exactly that. I know not how to express it. But everything in life pleases me. I find everything agreeable, and in the midst of my prayers for happiness, I find myself happy at being miserable. It is not I who undergo all this. My body weeps and cries, but something inside of me which is above me is glad of it all. Close quote. End footnote. The supreme contemporary example of such an inability to feel evil is, of course, Walt Whitman. His favorite occupation, writes his disciple, Dr. Buck, quote, seemed to be strolling or sauntering about outdoors by himself, looking at the grass, the trees, the flowers, the vistas of light, the varying aspects of the sky, and listening to the birds, the crickets, the tree frogs, and all the hundreds of natural sounds. It was evident that these things gave to him a pleasure far beyond what they give to ordinary people. Until I knew the man, it had not occurred to me that anyone could derive so much absolute happiness from these things as he did. He was very fond of flowers, either wild or cultivated, liked all sorts. I think he admired lilacs and sunflowers just as much as roses. Perhaps, indeed, no man who ever lived liked so many things and disliked so few as Walt Whitman. All natural objects seemed to have a charm for him. All sights and sounds seemed to please him. He appeared to like, and I believe he did like, all the men, women, and children he saw, though I never knew him to say that he liked anyone. But each who knew him felt that he liked him or her, and that he liked others also. I never knew him to argue or dispute, and he never spoke about money. He always justified, sometimes playfully, sometimes quite seriously, those who spoke harshly of himself or his writings, and I often thought he even took pleasure in the opposition of enemies. When I first knew him, I used to think that he watched himself, and would not allow his tongue to give expression to fretfulness, antipathy, complaint, and remonstrance. It did not occur to me as possible that these mental states could be absent in him. After long observation, however, I satisfied myself that such absence or unconsciousness was entirely real. He never spoke deprecatingly of any nationality or class of men, or time in the world's history, or against any trades or occupations, not even against any animals, insects, or inanimate things, nor any of the laws of nature, nor any of the results of those laws, such as illness, deformity, and death. He never complained or grumbled either at the weather, pain, illness, or anything else. He never swore. He could not very well, since he never spoke in anger, and apparently never was angry. He never exhibited fear, and I do not believe he ever felt it." Close quote. Walt Whitman owes his importance in literature to the systematic expulsion from his writings of all contractile elements. The only sentiments he allowed himself to express were of the expansive order, and he expressed these in the first person, not as your mere monstrously conceited individual might so express them, but vicariously for all men, so that a passionate and mystic ontological emotion suffuses his words, and ends by persuading the reader that men and women, life and death, and all things are divinely good. Thus it has come about that many persons today regard Walt Whitman as the restorer of the eternal natural religion. He has infected them with his own love of comrades, with his own gladness that he and they exist. Societies are actually formed for his cult. A periodical organ exists for its propagation, in which the lines of orthodoxy and heterodoxy are already beginning to be drawn. Hymns are written by others in his peculiar prosody, and he is even explicitly compared with the founder of the Christian religion, not altogether to the advantage of the latter. Whitman is often spoken of as a pagan. The word nowadays means sometimes the mere natural animal man without a sense of sin. Sometimes it means a Greek or Roman with his own peculiar religious consciousness. In neither of these senses does it fitly define this poet. He is more than your mere animal man who has not tasted of the tree of good and evil. He is aware enough of sin for a swagger to be present in his indifference towards it, a conscious pride in his freedom from flexions and contractions, which your genuine pagan, in the first sense of the word, would never show. Quote, "I could turn and live with animals. They are so placid and self-contained. I stand and look at them long and long. They do not sweat and whine about their condition. They do not lie awake in the dark and weep for their sins. Not one is dissatisfied. Not one is demented with the mania of owning things. Not one kneels to another, nor to his kind that lived thousands of years ago. not one is respectable or unhappy over the whole earth. Close quote. No natural pagan could have written these well-known lines. But on the other hand, Whitman is less than a Greek or Roman, for their consciousness, even in Homeric times, was full to the brim of the sad mortality of this sunlit world, and such a consciousness Walt Whitman resolutely refuses to adopt. When, for example, Achilles, about to slay Lycaon, Priam's young son, hears him sue for mercy, he stops to say, "Ah, friend, thou too must die. Why thus lamentest thou? Patroclus too is dead, who was better far than thou. Over me too hang death and forceful fate. There cometh morn or eve or some noonday when my life too some man shall take in battle, whether with spear he smite or arrow from the string." Then Achilles savagely severs the poor boy's neck with his sword, heaves him by the foot into the Scamander, and calls to the fishes of the river to eat the white fat of Lycaon. Just as here, the cruelty and the sympathy each ring true, and do not mix or interfere with one another, so did the Greeks and Romans keep all their sadnesses and gladnesses unmingled and entire. Instinctive good they did not reckon sin, nor had they any such desire to save the credit of the universe as to make them insist, as so many of us insist, that what immediately appears as evil must be good in the making, or something equally ingenious. Good was good, and bad just bad for the early Greeks. They neither denied the ills of nature, Walt Whitman's verse, "What is called good is perfect, and what is called bad is just as perfect," would have been mere silliness to them, nor did they, in order to escape from those ills, invent another and a better world of the imagination, in which, along with the ills, the innocent good of sense would also find no place. This integrity of the instinctive reactions, this freedom from all moral sophistry and strain, gives a pathetic dignity to ancient pagan feeling. And this quality Whitman's outpourings have not got. His optimism is too voluntary and defiant. His gospel has a touch of bravado and an affected twist, and this diminishes its effect on many readers who yet are well disposed towards optimism, and on the whole quite willing to admit that in important respects Whitman is of the genuine lineage of the prophets. Footnote: "God is afraid of me," remarked such a titanic, optimistic friend in my presence one morning when he was feeling particularly hardy and cannibalistic. The defiance of the phrase showed that a Christian education in humility still rankled in his breast. End footnote. If, then, we give the name of healthy-mindedness to the tendency which looks on all things and sees that they are good, we find that we must distinguish between a more involuntary and a more voluntary or systematic way of being healthy-minded. In its involuntary variety, healthy-mindedness is a way of feeling happy about things immediately. In its systematical variety, it is an abstract way of conceiving things as good. Every abstract way of conceiving things selects some one aspect of them as their essence for the time being, and disregards the other aspects. Systematic healthy-mindedness, conceiving good as the essential and universal aspect of being, deliberately excludes evil from its field of vision. And although, when thus nakedly stated, This might seem a difficult feat to perform for one who is intellectually sincere with himself and honest about facts. A little reflection shows that the situation is too complex to lie open to so simple a criticism. In the first place, happiness, like every other emotional state, has blindness and insensibility to opposing facts given it as its incentive weapon for self-protection against disturbance. When happiness is actually in possession, the thought of evil can no more acquire the feeling of reality than the thought of good can gain reality when melancholy rules. To the man actively happy, from whatever cause, evil simply cannot then and there be believed in. He must ignore it, and to the bystander, he may then seem perversely to shut his eyes to it and hush it up. But more than this, the hushing of it up may, in a perfectly candid and honest mind, grow into a deliberate religious policy, or parti pris. Much of what we call evil is due entirely to the way men take the phenomenon. It can so often be converted into a bracing and tonic good by a simple change of the sufferer's inner attitude from one of fear to one of fight. Its sting so often departs and turns into a relish when, after vainly seeking to shun it, we agree to face about and bear it cheerfully, that a man is simply bound in honor, with reference to many of the facts that seem at first to disconcert his peace, to adopt this way of escape. Refuse to admit their badness, despise their power, ignore their presence, turn your attention the other way, and so far as you yourself are concerned, at any rate, though the facts may still exist, their evil character exists no longer. Since you make them evil or good by your own thoughts about them, it is the ruling of your thoughts which proves to be your principal concern. The deliberate adoption of an optimistic turn of mind thus makes its entrance into philosophy, and once in, it is hard to trace its lawful bounds. Not only does the human instinct for happiness, bent on self-protection by ignoring, keep working in its favor, but higher inner ideals have weighty words to say. The attitude of unhappiness is not only painful, it is mean and ugly. What can be more base and unworthy than the pining, pulling, mumping mood, no matter by what outward ills it may have been engendered? What is more injurious to others? What less helpful as a way out of the difficulty? It but fastens and perpetuates the trouble which occasioned it, and increases the total evil of the situation. At all costs, then, we ought to reduce the sway of that mood. We ought to scout it in ourselves and others, and never show it tolerance. But it is impossible to carry on this discipline in the subjective sphere without zealously emphasizing the brighter and minimizing the darker aspects of the objective sphere of things at the same time. And thus, our resolution not to indulge in misery, beginning at a comparatively small point within ourselves, may not stop until it has brought the entire frame of reality under a systematic conception optimistic enough to be congenial with its needs. In all this, I say nothing of any mystical insight or persuasion that the total frame of things absolutely must be good. Such mystical persuasion plays an enormous part in the history of the religious consciousness, and we must look at it later with some care. But we need not go so far at present. More ordinary, non-mystical conditions of rapture suffice for my immediate contention. All invasive moral states and passionate enthusiasms make one feelingless to evil in some direction. The common penalties cease to deter the patriot. The usual prudences are flung by the lover to the winds. When the passion is extreme, suffering may actually be gloried in, provided it be for the ideal cause. Death may lose its sting, the grave its victory. In these states, the ordinary contrast of good and ill seems to be swallowed up in a higher denomination, an omnipotent excitement which engulfs the evil, and which the human being welcomes as the crowning experience of his life. This, he says, is truly to live, and I exult in the heroic opportunity and adventure. The systematic cultivation of healthy-mindedness as a religious attitude is therefore consonant with important currents in human nature, and is anything but absurd. In fact, we all do cultivate it more or less, even when our professed theology should inconsistency forbid it. We divert our attention from disease and death as much as we can, and the slaughterhouses and indecencies without end on which our life is founded are huddled out of sight and never mentioned, so that the world we recognize officially in literature and in society is a poetic fiction, far handsomer and cleaner and better than the world that really is. Footnote, quote, "As I go on in this life day by day, I become more of a bewildered child. I cannot get used to this world, to procreation, to heredity, to sight, to hearing. The commonest things are a burden. The prim, obliterated, polite surface of life, and the broad, body, and orgiastic or monadic foundations form a spectacle to which no habit reconciles me." Close quote. Robert Louis Stevenson. End footnote. The advance of liberalism, so-called, in Christianity during the past 50 years may fairly be called a victory of healthy-mindedness within the Church over a morbidness with which the old hellfire theology was more harmoniously related. We have now whole congregations whose preachers, far from magnifying our consciousness of sin, seem devoted rather to making little of it. They ignore or even deny eternal punishment, and insist on the dignity rather than on the depravity of man. They look at the continual preoccupation of the old-fashioned Christian with the salvation of his soul as something sickly and reprehensible rather than admirable, and a sanguine and muscular attitude which to our forefathers would have seemed purely heathen has become in their eyes an ideal element of Christian character. I am not asking whether or not they are right. I am only pointing out the change. The persons to whom I refer have still retained, for the most part, their nominal connection with Christianity, in spite of their discarding of its more pessimistic theological elements. But in that theory of evolution, which, gathering momentum for a century, has within the past 25 years swept so rapidly over Europe and America, we see the ground laid for a new sort of religion of nature, which has entirely displaced Christianity from the thought of a large part of our generation. The idea of a universal evolution lends itself to a doctrine of general meliorism and progress which fits the religious needs of the healthy-minded so well that it seems almost as if it might have been created for their use. Accordingly, we find evolutionism interpreted thus optimistically and embraced as a substitute for the religion they were born in by a multitude of our contemporaries who have either been trained scientifically or been fond of reading popular science, and who had already begun to be inwardly dissatisfied with what seemed to them the harshness and irrationality of the orthodox Christian scheme. As examples are better than descriptions, I will quote a document received in answer to Professor Starbuck's circular of questions. The writer's state of mind may by courtesy be called a religion, for it is his reaction on the whole nature of things. It is systematic and reflective, and it loyally binds him to certain inner ideals. I think you will recognize in him, coarse-meated and incapable of wounded spirit as he is, a sufficiently familiar contemporary type. Question: what does religion mean to you? Answer: it means nothing, and it seems, so far as I can observe, useless to others. I am 67 years of age, and have resided in X 50 years, and have been in business 45. Consequently, I have some little experience of life and men, and some women too. And I find that the most religious and pious people are, as a rule, those most lacking in uprightness and morality. The men who do not go to church or have any religious convictions are the best. Praying, singing of hymns, and sermonizing are pernicious. They teach us to rely on some supernatural power when we ought to rely on ourselves. I totally disbelieve in a God. The God idea was begotten in ignorance, fear, and a general lack of any knowledge of nature. If I were to die now, being in a healthy condition for my age, both mentally and physically, I would just as lief, yes, rather, die with a hearty enjoyment of music, sport, or any other rational pastime. As a timepiece stops, we die, there being no immortality in either case. Question: what comes before your mind corresponding to the words of God, heaven, angels, etc.? Answer: nothing whatever. I am a man without religion. These words mean so much mythic bosh. Question: have you had any experiences which appeared providential? Answer: none whatsoever. There is no agency of the superintending kind. A little judicious observation as well as knowledge of scientific law will convince anyone of this fact. Question: what things work most strongly on your emotions? Answer: lively songs and music. Pinafore instead of an Horatio. I like Scott, Burns, Byron, Longfellow, especially Shakespeare, etc., etc. Of songs, the Star-Spangled Banner, America, Marseillaise, and all moral and soul-stirring songs, but wishy-washy hymns are my detestation. I greatly enjoy nature, especially fine weather, and until within a few years used to walk Sundays into the country, 12 miles often, with no fatigue, and bicycle 40 or 50. I have dropped the bicycle. I never go to church, but attend lectures when there are any good ones. All of my thoughts and cogitations have been of a healthy and cheerful kind, for instead of doubts and fears, I see things as they are, for I endeavor to adjust myself to my environment. This I regard as the deepest law, Mankind is a progressive animal. I am satisfied he will have made a great advance over his present status 1,000 years hence. Question. What is your notion of sin? Answer. It seems to me that sin is a condition, a disease, incidental to man's development not being yet advanced enough. Morbidness over it increases the disease. We should think that 1,000,000 of years hence, equity, justice, and mental and physical good order will be so fixed and organized that no one will have any idea of evil or sin. Question. What is your temperament? Answer. Nervous, active, wide awake, mentally and physically. Sorry that nature compels us to sleep at all. If we are in search of a broken and contrite heart, clearly we need not look at this brother. His contentment with the finite encases him like a lobster shell, and shields him from all morbid repining at his distance from the infinite. We have in him an excellent example of the optimism which may be encouraged by popular science. To my mind, a current far more important and interesting religiously than that which sets in from natural science towards healthy-mindedness is that which has recently poured over America and seems to be gathering force every day. I am ignorant what foothold it may yet have acquired in Great Britain, and to which, for the sake of having a brief designation, I will give the title of the Mind Cure Movement. There are various sects of this new thought, to use another of the names by which it calls itself, but their agreements are so profound that their differences may be neglected for my present purpose, and I will treat the movement without apology as if it were a simple thing. It is a deliberately optimistic scheme of life, with both a speculative and a practical side. In its gradual development during the last quarter of a century, it has taken up into itself a number of contradictory elements, and it must now be reckoned with as a genuine religious power. It has reached the stage, for example, when the demand for its literature is great enough for insincere stuff mechanically produced for the market to be to a certain extent supplied by publishers, a phenomenon never observed, I imagine, until a religion has got well past its earliest insecure beginnings. One of the doctrinal sources of mind cure is the Four Gospels. Another is Emersonianism, or New England Transcendentalism. Another is Berkeleyan idealism. Another is Spiritism, with its messages of law and progress and development. Another, the optimistic popular science evolutionism, of which I have recently spoken. And finally, Hinduism has contributed a strain. But the most characteristic feature of the mind cure movement is an inspiration much more direct. The leaders in this faith have had an intuitive belief in the all-saving power of healthy-minded attitudes as such, and the conquering efficacy of courage, hope, and trust, and a correlative contempt for doubt, fear, worry, and all nervously precautionary states of mind. Their belief has in a general way been corroborated by the practical experience of their disciples, and this experience forms today a mass imposing in amount. Footnote: Cautionary Verses for Children. This title of a much-used work, published early in the 19th century, shows how far the muse of evangelical Protestantism in England, with her mind fixed on the idea of danger, had at last drifted away from the original gospel freedom. Mind cure might be briefly called a reaction against all that religion of chronic anxiety which marked the earlier part of our century in the evangelical circles of England and America. End footnote. The blind have been made to see, the halt to walk. Lifelong invalids have had their health restored. The moral fruits have been no less remarkable. The deliberate adoption of a healthy-minded attitude has proved possible to many who never supposed they had it in them. Regeneration of character has gone on an extensive scale, and cheerfulness has been restored to countless homes. The indirect influence of this has been great. The mind cure principles are beginning so to pervade the air that one catches their spirit at second hand. One hears of the gospel of relaxation, of the don't worry movement, of people who repeat to themselves youth, health, vigor when dressing in the morning as their motto for the day. Complaints of the weather are getting to be forbidden in many households, and more people are recognizing it to be bad form to speak of disagreeable sensations, or to make much of the ordinary inconveniences and ailments of life. These general tonic effects on public opinion would be good even if the more striking results were non-existent. But the later abound so that we can afford to overlook the innumerable failures and self-deceptions that are mixed in with them. For in everything human, failure is a matter of course. And we can also overlook the verbiage of a good deal of the mind cure literature, some of which is so moonstruck with optimism and so vaguely expressed that an academically trained intellect finds it almost impossible to read at all. The plain fact remains that the spread of the movement has been due to practical fruits, and the extremely practical turn of character of the American people has never been better shown than by the fact that this, their only decidedly original contribution to the systematic philosophy of life, should be so intimately knit up with concrete therapeutics. To the importance of mind cure, the medical and clerical professions in the United States are beginning, though with much recalcitrancy and protesting, to open their eyes. It is evidently bound to develop still farther, both speculatively and practically, and its latest writers are far and away the ablest of the group. It matters nothing that, just as there are hosts of persons who cannot pray, so there are greater hosts who cannot by any possibility be influenced by the mind curer's ideas. For our immediate purpose, the important point is that so large a number should exist who can be so influenced. They form a psychic type to be studied with respect. Footnote. Lest my own testimony be suspected, I will quote another reporter, H. Goddard of Clark University, whose thesis on the effects of mind on body as evidenced by faith cures is published in the American Journal of Psychology. This critic, after a wide study of the facts, concludes that the cures by mind cure exist, but are in no respect different from those now officially recognized in medicine as cures by suggestion. And the end of his essay contains an interesting physiological speculation as to the way in which the suggestive ideas may work. As regards the general phenomenon of mental cure itself, Dr. Goddard writes, quote, "In spite of the severe criticism we have made of reports of cure, there still remains a vast amount of material showing a powerful influence of the mind in disease. Many cases are of diseases that have been diagnosed and treated by the best physicians of the country, or which prominent hospitals have tried their hand at curing, but without success, people of culture and education have been treated by this method with satisfactory results. Diseases of long standing have been ameliorated and even cured. We have traced the mental element through primitive medicine and folk medicine of today, patent medicine and witchcraft. We are convinced that it is impossible to account for the existence of these practices if they did not cure disease, and that if they cure disease, it must have been the mental element that was effective. The same argument applies to those modern schools of mental therapeutics, divine healing and Christian Science. It is hardly conceivable that the large body of intelligent people who comprise the body known distinctively as mental scientists should continue to exist if the whole thing were a delusion. It is not a thing of a day. It is not confined to a few. It is not local. It is true that many failures are recorded, but that only adds to the argument. There must be many and striking successes to counterbalance the failures. Otherwise, the failures would have ended the delusion. Christian Science, divine healing, or mental science do not and never can, in the very nature of things, cure all diseases. Nevertheless, the practical applications of the general principles of the broadest mental science will tend to prevent disease. We do find sufficient evidence to convince us that the proper reform in mental attitude would relieve many a sufferer of ills that the ordinary physician cannot touch, would even delay the approach of death to many a victim beyond the power of absolute cure, and the faithful adherence to a truer philosophy of life will keep many a man well and give the doctor time to devote to alleviating ills that are unpreventable. Close quote. End footnote. To come now to a little closer quarters with their creed. The fundamental pillar on which it rests is nothing more than a general basis of all religious experience. The fact that man has a dual nature and is connected with two spheres of thought, a shallower and a profounder sphere, in either of which he may learn to live more habitually. The shallower and lower sphere is that of the fleshly sensations, instincts, and desires, of egotism, doubt, and the lower personal interests. But whereas Christian theology has always considered forwardness to be the essential vice of this part of human nature, the mind-curers say that the mark of the beast in it is fear, and this is what gives such an entirely new religious turn to their persuasion. To quote a writer of the school, quote, "Fear has had its uses in the evolutionary process, and it seems to constitute the whole of forethought in most animals. But that it should remain any part of the mental equipment of human civilized life is an absurdity. I find that the fear element of forethought is not stimulating to those more civilized persons to whom duty and attraction are the natural motives, but is weakening and deterrent. As soon as it becomes unnecessary, fear becomes a positive deterrent, and should be entirely removed, as dead flesh is removed from living tissue. To assist in the analysis of fear, and in the denunciation of its expressions, I have coined the word fear thought to stand for the unprofitable element of forethought, and have defined the word worry as fear thought in contradistinction to forethought. I have also defined fear thought as the self-imposed or self-permitted suggestion of inferiority, in order to place it where it really belongs, in the category of harmful, unnecessary, and therefore not respectful things." Close quote. The misery habit, the martyr habit, engendered by the prevalent fear thought, get pungent criticism from the Mind Cure writers. Quote, "Consider for a moment the habits of life into which we are born. There are certain social conventions or customs and alleged requirements. There is a theological bias, a general view of the world. There are conservative ideas in regard to our early training, our education, marriage, and occupation in life. Following close upon this, there is a long series of anticipations, namely, that we shall suffer certain children's diseases, diseases of middle age and of old age, the thought that we shall grow old, lose our faculties, and again become childlike, while crowning all is the fear of death. Then there is a long line of particular fears and trouble-bearing expectations, such, for example, as ideas associated with certain articles of food, the dread of the east wind, the terrors of hot weather, the aches and pains associated with cold weather, the fear of catching cold if one sits in a draught, the coming of hay fever upon the 14th of August in the middle of the day, and so on through a long list of fears, dreads, worriments, anxieties, anticipations, expectations, pessimisms, morbidities, and the whole ghastly train of fateful shapes which our fellow men, and especially physicians, are ready to help us conjure up, an array worthy to rank with Bradley's unearthly ballet of bloodless categories. Yet this is not all. This vast array is swelled by innumerable volunteers from daily life, the fear of accident, the possibility of calamity, the loss of property, the chance of robbery, of fire, or the outbreak of war, and it is not deemed sufficient to fear for ourselves. When a friend is taken ill, we must forthwith fear the worst and apprehend death. If one meets with sorrow, sympathy means to enter into and increase the suffering." Close quote. To quote another writer, quote, "Man often has fear stamped upon him before his entrance into the outer world. He is reared in fear. All his life is passed into bondage to fear of disease and death, and thus his whole mentality becomes cramped, limited, and depressed, and his body follows its shrunken pattern and specification. Think of the millions of sensitive and responsive souls among our ancestors who have been under the dominion of such a perpetual nightmare. Is it not surprising that health exists at all? Nothing but the boundless divine love, exuberance, and vitality constantly poured in, even though unconsciously to us, could in some degree neutralize such an ocean of morbidity." Close quote. Although the disciples of the Mind Cure often use Christian terminology, one sees from such quotations how widely their notion of the fall of man diverges from that of ordinary Christians. Footnote: whether it differs so much from Christ's own notion is for the exegetes to decide. According to Harnack, Jesus felt about evil and disease much as our mind cures do. "What is the answer which Jesus sends to John the Baptist?" asks Harnack, and says it is this, quote, "The blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, the dead rise up, and the gospel is preached to the poor. That is the coming of the kingdom, or rather, in these saving works, the kingdom is already there. By the overcoming and removal of misery, of need, of sickness, of these actual effects, John is to see that the new time has arrived. The casting out of devils is only a part of this work of redemption, but Jesus points to that as the sense and seal of his mission. Thus to the wretched, sick, and poor did he address himself, but not as a moralist, and without a trace of sentimentalism. He never makes groups and departments of the ills. He never spends time in asking whether the sick one deserves to be cured, and it never occurs to him to sympathize with the pain or the death. He nowhere says that sickness is a beneficent infliction and that evil has a healthy use. No, he calls sickness sickness and health health. All evil, all wretchedness is for him something dreadful. It is of the great kingdom of Satan, but he feels the power of the Savior within him. He knows that advance is possible only when weakness is overcome, when sickness is made well. Close quote. End footnote. Their notion of man's higher nature is hardly less divergent, being decidedly pantheistic. The spiritual in man appears in the mind-cure philosophy as partly conscious, but chiefly subconscious, and through the subconscious part of it, we are already one with the divine without any miracle of grace or abrupt creation of a new inner man. As this view is variously expressed by different writers, we find in it traces of Christian mysticism, of transcendental idealism, of Vedantism, and of the modern psychology of the subliminal self. A quotation or two will put us at the central point of view. Quote, "The great central fact of the universe is that spirit of infinite life and power that is back of all, that manifests itself in and through all. This spirit of infinite life and power that is back of all is what I call God. I care not what term you may use, be it kindly light, providence, the oversoul, omnipotence, or whatever term may be most convenient, so long as we are agreed in regard to that great central fact itself. God, then, fills the universe alone, so that all is from him and in him, and there is nothing that is outside. He is the life of our very life itself. We are partakers of the life of God, and though we differ from him in that we are individualized spirits, while he is the infinite spirit, including us as well as all else beside, yet in essence the life of God and the life of man are identically the same, and so are one. They differ not in essence or quality, they differ in degree. The great central fact in human life is the coming into a conscious, vital realization of our oneness with this infinite life, and the opening of ourselves fully to this divine inflow. In just the degree that we come into a conscious realization of our oneness with the infinite life, and open ourselves to this divine inflow, do we actualize in ourselves the qualities and powers of the infinite life? Do we make ourselves channels through which the infinite intelligence and power can work? In just the degree in which you realize your oneness with the infinite spirit, you will exchange disease for ease, inharmony for harmony, suffering and pain for abounding health and strength. To recognize our own divinity and our intimate relation to the universal is to attach the belts of our machinery to the powerhouse of the universe. One need remain in hell no longer than one chooses to. We can rise to any heaven we ourselves choose. And when we choose so to rise, all the higher power